Hare Krishna. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prashtaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swam Nityamane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharane Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Pastach Desatane Vanchakal Paturubhascha Kripa Sindhivya Evacha Patatanam Pavanebhyo Vaishanebhyo Namo Namaha. So today we'd like to talk about integrating compassion into our lives. And we are extremely fortunate that we have been graced by the association of His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, who is the embodiment of compassion. And by his love and compassion and caring, he's brought all us together here in this room and in his movement. And it's such a great fortune we have to be able to partake of that nectar of his compassion. And so our whole lineage is based on the idea of compassion. Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he's known as the most munificent incarnation, Namo Mahavarinaya Krishna Premapadayate. And our theology and philosophy, even from the second verse of the Srimad Bhagavatam, it is really stressing the importance of compassion, even in understanding the essence of our philosophy. So in the second verse of Srimad Bhagavatam, you will read, the highest truth is reality distinguished from illusion for the welfare of all. So that knowledge, I'm reading that knowledge not just for my own benefit, but I'm reading that knowledge with the understanding that that knowledge is actually for everyone's benefit. And I'm trying to understand how I can utilize this knowledge to help others, to help themselves. And so compassion comes from the Latin word compati. So pati means to suffer, and the word com means with. So compassion actually means to suffer with. So compassion is quite different than sympathy. Sympathy might look like if you broke your leg and I came and I said, oh, hi, how are you doing? That must be very difficult. You broke your leg. I feel really sorry for you. See you later. But compassion to suffer with means that if you broke your leg, I might come and say, wow, that must be really difficult for you. Can you tell me how that's affecting your life? I must really put a wrench in the works like you're supposed to be working, and tell me how this is affecting you. So compassion means to really understand the sufferings of another. And compassion, it's innate within all of us. There was some extensive research done on the nature of compassion, and it was found that even violently aggressive criminals, when they were asked about what they valued in life, a common factor that came up in all these people, unless they were complete psychopaths, was that they wanted to be compassionate. They wanted to be better persons. But somehow they became completely disconnected from their own compassionate nature. And so that's an extreme example. And all of us, even as aspiring Vaishnavas, we're aspiring to come to that platform of compassion, but sometimes we're not quite fully there. Like we may be very compassionate and kind and friendly to people in the temple, and we go out at Sankirtan and Harinam, we tend to be very giving and very compassionate. Sometimes when we're in our own ashrams behind closed doors, sometimes we may behave a little differently. Sometimes we might not come to that standard. Maharaj was saying something that he said that my wife and I have never had an argument. And that's actually not true. In 51 years of marriage, I think we had actually 2 arguments that were a little escalated, and one was 2 days ago. I'll tell you about that a little later. So we're going to look at how to integrate compassion more fully. So compassion, I'm going to ask you, what does compassion look like when it's flourishing and when it's shining? What would it manifest? Can you in the audience, can you just shout out some some symptoms of compassion, like it might be that, I have a helping mood. So maybe you can raise your hand and shout it out, and maybe Mangalananda can just repeat them so I can hear them, and then Badera, I think, is going to write on the flip chart. What does compassion look like? Can anyone tell me what's compassion going to look like when it's manifest?
Love for others.
Love for others.
Love for others, okay. And what else?
Yes.
Listening.
Listening.
Yes, listening, yeah. Empathy.
Feeling the pain.
Feeling the pain.
Yes.
Helping. Trying to identify with the person.
Okay, we got to helping and trying to identify with the person.
Good, yes. Any others?
Understanding.
Understanding.
Understanding, yeah.
Guiding.
Guiding. Guiding.
Guiding, yeah. Guiding, teaching, mentoring, yeah. Anything else?
Walking in another person's shoes. Walking in another person's shoes.
Yeah, yeah. So those are all different ways that compassion manifests. And I think one other one we didn't really mention is, so when we're performing those compassion activities, what does it feel like? How would you feel if you're on the receiving end or the giving end of compassion? What would it feel like? Few words, just one word. What would it feel like?
Humility. Okay. Humble.
Going to feel humble. What else?
Supported.
Is that supportive?
Supported. Yeah.
Supported, yeah. And if you're giving it, how are you going to feel? What do you feel like when you preach to someone about Krishna consciousness for the first time? What does it feel like?
Relieved.
Relief, yeah.
Satisfied.
Satisfied.
Satisfied, yeah.
Gratitude.
Gratitude, yeah.
Human bonding.
Human bonding.
Beyond race and
Bonding, yeah. Connected, yes.
Beyond designations.
I feel sad because they're suffering, and you're supposed to feel their suffering. You feel sad. I'm really sad you're suffering.
Sadness.
Isn't it?
So you feel that empathy, yeah.
Yeah, it's not like, wow, I feel great because I'm helping you. Right?
Well, I think the result is that even though you're identifying with that suffering of the other person, you feel sad, but it kind of gives you this, I don't know how you describe it, kind of a feeling of expansion.
Okay. Understanding or finding out why they are suffering.
So you're going to be inquisitive. Okay, so we're going to just flip the coin, and we're going to look at the opposite. So what does it feel like when maybe we're not being very compassionate in those moments when we're harsh with others, we're kind of failing at compassion? What is that going to look like? How is that going to manifest?
Selfishness.
Selfishness, yeah. What else?
Guilt. Guilty.
Guilt, yeah.
stressful.
Stress.
Yes, stress.
Stressful. Stress.
Yeah, stressful.
The opposite of bonding is like alienation.
Alienated. Alienation.
Alienation, yeah.
Unhappy.
Hard-hearted. Hard-hearted.
Hard-hearted, yeah.
Disconnected.
Disconnected.
Disconnected, yeah.
Callous.
Callous, yeah. Yeah.
Indifferent.
Indifferent, yeah. What about anger? And failing at compassion, it can also manifest as things like fault finding. It can manifest as emotional abuse, and it can even manifest as physical abuse. So those kind of activities, some of the feelings came out in the list you were making, but we will feel like selfish, painful, angry, and disempowered. So there's quite a spectrum difference between compassion and failing at compassion. Let me ask you a question. Do we have a choice to be compassionate or not to be compassionate? When situations arise, when there's some provocation, do we have a choice? If you think you have a choice, raise your hand. I can see most of you. Do we have a choice to be compassionate? Yeah. Are we victims of circumstance? Are we helpless? No. So we're not. So we do have a choice. And there's an interesting Vedic word. It's called Sva Tantra Ratna. Sva Tantra Ratna. And that means, Sva means one's own choice. Sva means one's own. Tantra means choice. And Ratna, interestingly, means jewel. So by the mercy of Krishna, we've all been given this most valuable jewel, which is the jewel of self-choice. And by utilizing that self-choice, we have these opportunities to embrace moments where we can be compassionate. And when we forget that we have that jewel of choice, sometimes we become reactive, and we tend to act in ways that are not so compassionate. So we understand we want to be compassionate. Question is it always easy? If you think it's easy to always be compassionate, raise your hand. Okay, if you think it's difficult sometimes to be compassionate, raise your hand. I'll raise my hand. So I think Maharaj and Anutama were talking about my passport dilemma, and it's been extremely stressful. It didn't come in time to come on this trip. We are scheduled to go to Europe in October, and I finally got through to the passport office. And if I'm lucky now, my passport will arrive 2 days before we're supposed to fly to Europe. And it's extremely stressful. And so this is all going on. And then day before yesterday, my wife just flipped out. She just got like really mad at me that I didn't have my passport. And wow, I was like she was so escalated, I actually got escalated. So I'm going to tell you more about that later, but that's just a little primer that I personally understand that it's very difficult sometimes to be compassionate and patient in trying circumstances. So I'd like to ask you to brainstorm why sometimes is it difficult to be compassionate? Some kind of situation like that. Why is it difficult? What are some factors that might make it difficult to be compassionate? Can anyone throw any ideas up? Maybe everyone can brainstorm. Mangalananda can repeat so I can hear.
You want me to pass the mic around? Is it
I
long
think
answer?
it might be better. It might be quicker if you just repeat.
Okay. Sorry, you just spoke, right? Situations?
Situations, yeah. Situational, yeah, that's very true. What kind of situations?
So sometimes we want to be compassionate, but based on some other dependency in our life, like family situations or financial situations, not.
If you can just say that, why we fail in one or two words, what is it that's causing the problem? One or two words.
Family or financial.
Family or financial circumstances.
Financial, yeah, that's going to be like stress for sure. Stress.
Preoccupied. So you're busy.
Distracted. Yeah, busy. Totally. Anything else?
Someone else may have. Sometimes it will be somebody else will have that person.
Okay, someone else will take care of it.
Leave it to someone else.
Did you catch that one, Partha?
No, I didn't catch that.
That someone else will do it. Someone else will take care of that.
So laziness. Or tired, lazy. Okay. One hand in the back there.
The person is
Two hands.
person to deal with.
The person is simply a difficult person to deal with.
Yeah. Depends how difficult. Are we talking someone who's a narcissist, sociopath, or maybe someone just having a bad day and we're not able to be there for them? Anything else? Take just one more.
Okay, selfishness.
Selfishness, yeah.
They are selfish or we are being selfish? Okay, we are being selfish.
Yeah, it could be. And it could be the other way too. So that's very true. Sometimes there's environmental factors why we can fail at compassion, such as busy, hungry, tired, and stressed. So those become like filters. And in that situation, the filter amplifies the situation and makes it difficult to deal with. So environmental factors are definitely make it difficult to be compassionate. And in Kali Yuga, we're all affected by those environmental factors of being busy, stressed, tired, especially sometimes men, they're hangry, they're hungry. It becomes a kind of a filter. But there's also psychological factors and physiological factors that can also complicate the situation for us to try to manifest compassion. So it can be beneficial to try to understand the psychological and physiological effects. So sometimes we might ask, well, why do we need to understand physiology and psychology? Because we understand that the chanting of Hare Krishna, it's the panacea for all problems and all material diseases. Isn't that a fact? And yes, that is absolutely 100% true that chanting Hare Krishna will solve all these problems and manifest our full compassion. And that is true based on the following statement that Srila Prabhupada made here. I'm just going to stop here. So this was in Purports 1.5.22. Scientific knowledge engaged in the service of the Lord and all similar activities are all factually Hari Kirtan or glorification of the Lord. So that's a very significant statement that Prabhupada is saying that these things like psychology and physiology, understanding them can actually help us in our spiritual life. So we'd like to examine how some of these psychological and physical factors can sometimes make it a little difficult to be fully compassionate. So we are seated on a machine, Krishna says, made of material energy. And so if you have a car, that most of us probably have cars that are made after 1980, they all have a computer with chips and circuits. And today's cars are very, very complex. So we're also driving in a vehicle, this human body. We are spirit souls within this body, and we have this incredibly complex organism called the human brain, which has hundreds of thousands of circuits. Within our brain, there's something like 86 billion neurons that are storing and recording information. And so we understand that our spiritual knowledge is coming from within the heart. We say Divya Gana Hridi Prakasito, that spiritual knowledge is manifest by the mercy of the Guru and Krishna within the heart. But simultaneously, we are within this vehicle, and we need to know how to drive the vehicle. At least you need to know there's forward and there's reverse, there's a brake and accelerator, there's a gas gauge, an oil light, a temperature gauge, a few small things you need to know to run the vehicle. So in the same way, we're in this vehicle of the body, and if we can understand a few things, how it works, it can greatly facilitate our spiritual progress. So this is a somewhat simplified version of the human brain, and I don't think you have to worry about the specific medical names, at least if you can understand higher self, which is here, and lower self, which is here. So our higher self correlates to the prefrontal cortex, which is the top part of the brain. And that part of the brain deals with empathy, insight, response flexibility, emotional regulation, bodily regulation, morality, intuition, attuned communication, and fear modulation. And in recent years, science has begun to understand how the brain actually works. Previously, 100 years ago, it was like a mysterious black box, and the only thing they knew about the brain, if someone had a specific brain injury and a certain part of the brain didn't work, they could understand that, okay, that part of the brain is responsible for this. But now with advances in science, they can actually see literally how the brain is working, interacting, how these neural pathways are formed. So there's an incredible amount of science about the brain, and it very much verifies what we understand from Bhagavad Gita, how we have a higher and a lower self. So higher self, again, logic, reason, that's called the prefrontal cortex. We have something called the limbic brain, which is also very related to something called the amygdala. Again, you can forget that and just think lower self. That part of the brain deals with fight, flight, freeze, stress responses. Are we safe? Are we not safe? And also it records emotions. So you have many experiences. Sometimes we might have a traumatic experience. Let's say I was in a house once that happened to be blue and the house caught on fire and I just barely got out alive. That's going to leave a very strong type of traumatic impression in my brain, and that becomes literally stored in the neural pathways within our brain. And many years later, someone might invite me to their house. I'm walking up the stairs. It's a blue house. Those memories can be stimulated just by seeing that blue house, by the association of that house to those past memories. Those memories can come forward in my consciousness. I might smell the smoke of the fire. I might literally hear the sound of the alarm. I might feel the same kind of fear and panic. It's not logical. I'm just going to a friend's blue house. But that's the way these impressions are stored. And those kind of impressions can complicate things in our lives. So there's a couple examples I can give from individuals that we've known in our service and dealing with couples and individuals of how this can play out. There was one devotee, I'll mention his name because he was talking about this publicly in a seminar. He and his wife have been married for 30 years, and they said this pattern developed in the relationship. This man, Gora, he would come home from work, his wife would be in the kitchen cooking, and almost every day, very, very regularly, he would just ask this question, what are you doing? Simple thing. And after some time, she started to find that incredibly annoying, that he's asking the same question every single day. What are you doing? So one day, she had been a little stressed the whole day. He came home and he asked this question, what are you doing? And she said, what kind of stupid question is that? Can't you see I'm cooking? You ask this stupid question every single day. And then he flipped out, stormed out of the room, and the whole rest of the day was completely ruined. And so they had just taken some training in communication, reflective listening, Rupa Goswami's principle of revealing your mind in confidence and hearing in confidence. And they told us how after that little explosion, they had a discussion to try to find out what happened there, what happened between us. And it came out that when he was a child, a young boy, very often he was left at home by himself for long periods of time. So he realized that when he came home, he needed this sense of connection, that there was someone there and he could connect. So his question, what are you doing? It was a bid for some kind of secure connection. And when she rejected that, it just triggered this emotion, this fear of when he was a child and feeling alone. And realizing that, it changed the whole dynamic. So when he would ask the question, she would say, oh, I'm doing fine. Give him a hug. You want to help me cook? And they would connect. There's another example. We had one young lady. She, even as an infant, sometimes when she was crying, her father would put her downstairs at the bottom of the stairs and close the door. And she could not even crawl at that time. So she had this memory as a child of being stranded at the bottom of the stairs alone. When she was older, a toddler, sometimes when she would misbehave, her father would put her on top of a fridge and leave the room, and she would be stranded there alone on top of the fridge. And I mean, factually, that is child abuse. So that left some very strong impressions in her mind, in her neurological pathways. So many years later, she's married, she's working, her husband sends her a text message, I'm going to be late to pick you up today, don't know what time I can make it. And she would completely freak out. She would just panic. And then when she would see him, she would get incredibly angry, and he couldn't understand what's happening. It just, I'm like half an hour late. But that trauma, it became manifest with the inner consciousness in a way that was very real. She was experiencing that. So she actually had to take some counseling to be able to process those hurts of the past so they wouldn't be projected into the present. One other much more serious incident, this is a composite of several individuals I know. This individual, as a child, he was continually ridiculed by his father, told he was never good enough, nothing he could do was right. Even sometimes he was punished very severely physically. And so he grew up in that atmosphere, which was very difficult, and left some very strong traumatic impressions in his consciousness. As a result of that feeling of inadequacy he had from growing up, he worked very hard and compensated that by being a real overachiever. He just had to continually be busy, continually feeling like he was succeeding. The only downside was that if there was any tinge of criticism, it was very, very hard on him. And sometimes he would become angry if he was even criticized subtly. And so that became very problematic in this marriage, that if his wife said anything that was a hint of a criticism, he would fly into an absolute rage, just unexplainable rage, which eventually began to manifest as physical violence. So what was happening with him, those impressions from the past were so strong, the only way he could deal with it was the only way he knew as a child, which was the way he saw his father do it, was to become angry. And that anger produced adrenaline. When you get really angry, it produces adrenaline. And in that kind of a situation, the adrenaline numbs that pain of inadequacy and gives the abusive individual, a sense of power. And unfortunately, in that kind of a dynamic, I think John was talking about different kinds of addiction, and there's one kind of addiction in these kind of situations. It's called an anger junkie, that people become just so prone to become angry because it masks that pains of the past. So those are different ways in which impressions from the past can physiologically manifest in the future and sabotage our relationships. So in that last case, the individuals would definitely need some extremely serious counseling. So again, the brain is very complex, and I'd like to boil it down to something very, very simple that you can explain. You can explain it to a 3-year-old, and you can explain it to someone who's 84 years old. And you can also use this simple example. It's called a hand model of the brain. You can use this if you're selling someone a Bhagavad Gita. You can tell them about mind control, how everyone's trying to control the mind. Even doctors are meditating. Doctors are recommending meditation. They're giving prescriptions for people to meditate. They understand the value of it because it helps to pacify the mind. So you can use this example when you're trying to sell a Bhagavad Gita, how this can help you control your mind practically. So if you can just hold your hand in front of you like that for a second. And so we're going to make this into a hand model of the brain. So the top part of your brain here, my fingers, that would be this prefrontal cortex. So just think higher self. That's the higher self. Again, this deals with logic, reason, self-control, compassion, etc. And below the higher self, prefrontal cortex, is the actual lower self, which is called the amygdala or the limbic system. And again, you can forget that. Just think lower self. Again, fight, fight, flight, freeze, and memories are stored here. So this part of your brain, this lower self, amygdala, limbic system, it can be invaluable. In a dangerous situation, you're in a house that's on fire. This part of your brain will kick in. Okay, this is a flight situation. It's going to signal your body to produce adrenaline and cortisol, which will just send energy to all your extremities, your muscles, so you can get out of there as fast as you can. What happens when that kicks in is you can lose contact with your higher self. So the higher self, again here, its purpose is self-regulation. And when the lower self kicks in, the adrenaline, cortisol, and they've actually observed this scientifically, how the cortisol causes the higher self, the prefrontal cortex, literally to go to sleep, to stop its function. So you can fight, flight, or free when it's necessary. So sometimes there's these kind of stimuluses in our life, and the higher self, its purpose is to regulate. Okay, that's not a fire. That's just a ghee lamp burning. It's not going to burn the house down. You're okay. The higher self can regulate it. And also there's a psychological term with the higher self and emotions that if you can name an emotion, you can tame it. So I might feel some anger coming up, but if I examine that emotion, I can say, well, I'm not actually angry. I'm just tired. So I've named the emotion, and you can tame the emotion. And literally, science shows that when you do this process of self-regulation by understanding emotions and naming them, this higher self signals the body to produce a peptide called GABA. And again, you don't need to understand that. It's called GABA, which soothes and prevents the lower self from taking over in situations. So there's a type of emotional regulation that goes on there. So we've all heard this expression, I flipped my lid. And so what happens is sometimes a situation comes, there's some strong emotion, and whether it's warranted or not, sometimes this lower part of the brain, the lower self, produces this adrenaline, and it causes the higher self to literally disconnect. We literally flip our lids. And when the lid is flipped, especially in these kind of social situations, you're with friends having arguments, your wife, partner, girlfriend, whatever, when you have those kind of negative exchanges, you flip your lid. Anything that you say that comes out of your mouth, it's going to pretty much be garbage. It's not going to be productive. And what can happen sometimes, that's what happened to me. My wife a couple of days ago, she flipped out about the passport and was like blaming me. And I flipped out. And what happens in that situation was she flipped her lid, I flipped my lid. So we're both functioning from the lower self. And what happens when two individuals are stimulated by the lower self, you end up in what they call thumb wars, which are completely unproductive. There's no logic, reason, and self-control when you're in this mode. And we both got so escalated, I had to go for a walk to cool off. So that when I came back, I'll explain later how we resolved that later. But the point is, if both of you become escalated, nothing productive is going to come from it. And if you have children also, sometimes you'll see there's a child, all of a sudden the child flips its lid. And the child actually wants to do what you want to do. They want to listen to you, but when they're escalated, they become completely controlled by their lower self. And small children, this prefrontal cortex, it's not fully developed. So even if they wanted to, it's not developed. So small kids don't have that emotional regulation. So sometimes you see the kids flipped, then the parent flips, and the flipped out parent is trying to pacify the flipped out kid. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. It's going to take a long time for that kid to self-regulate. But if the parent can stay in control through their higher self, they can kind of comfort the child and say, well, I see that you're experiencing some really strong emotions here. I'm a little worked up too. Let's maybe just relax and see, what we can do to relax you. And so even there's research, they're teaching this to kids as young as 4 years old. They're teaching it in schools to young kids, and they're finding the kids have better emotional regulation, better classroom behavior, better grades, because they learn how to actually utilize their higher self to regulate this lower self, which sometimes can flip our lids and cause many, many problems. So why do we flip our lids? So I'm sure we've all been in a situation like this. You go out in Harinam, and there's always some guy, making some crazy, nasty remark about the devotees. But because we don't really know the person, it's like water rolling off a duck's back. It doesn't really affect us. However, if we experience some criticism or painful words from someone we love, that can become very, very impactful. And it's known in psychology as the mirror of love, that our sense of self-worth comes from how we perceive those we love view us. So if those we love give us positive feedback, that kind of builds our self-esteem and sense of worth. If they criticize us, it's very hard. It's especially that's very hard for men in close relationships with their partner, because men's nature, as Prabhupada said, is to protect the wife. So men feel successful if their wife is protected, happy, peaceful, and satisfied. And when they perceive that their significant other is criticizing them, it triggers within men a fear, because the biggest fear men have is the fear of inadequacy, and especially the fear of not protecting, making happy and peaceful the person we love the most. So that can also be a very powerful dynamic in marriage, which can again complicate the ability to actually manifest compassion. So I'm going to ask you, how many of you have experienced something like this? Raise your hand if you've ever been in a situation, your spouse, your girlfriend, someone very dear to you, partner, was criticizing like that. Have you ever experienced that? Okay, some hands are going up there. Yeah, I mean, I experienced that 2 days ago. Wow, it's really painful. Very painful. So remember, compati, suffer with, compassion. Remember, compati, compassion. Remember this jewel that Krishna has given us called Sva Tantra Ratna, one's own sense of self-control, one's own sense of choice. We all have that. So I'm going to ask you, in that situation we just saw, someone you love is just like dumping on you. I'll use that word, dumping on you. How could you be compassionate in that situation? What could you do to be compassionate? When it happened to me that day, wow, I was just like struggling not to be defensive. So how would you be compassionate? Anyone got any suggestions? What are you going to do?
Pause before you respond.
Pause before you respond.
Pause before you respond. Okay, yeah. That's very good, because you can pause and you can think, well, I have a choice, right? Sva Tantra Ratna. And what are you going to do with that? In that pause, when you make the choice, what can you do? What can you do?
Listen.
Listen, yeah. And you might want to, even listening, you can also, you can try to validate their experience even though you don't agree with it. In this situation, I mean, we were all so mad, it was unbelievable. I actually went out for a walk. I drove the car, went to this place. about half a mile away. There's a big view and just tried to cool off. And then I came home and I said to my wife, I said, okay, Uttama, I'm ready to talk now. And then, well, she just started dumping on me again. And I was just like, it's like really hard. It's really hard. And so finally I just said, well, Uttama, I'm guessing that you're really, I'm guessing that you're really frustrated and angry that somehow I didn't get the passport. And that's making you really disturbed and angry at me. And she said, yeah, kind of, but not exactly. And she said, well, actually, I'm just so fried with the government that they can't get it together to produce these passports in some timely manner. She said, I'm totally fried. She said, they're nowhere near here. They're like 400 miles away in Vancouver. She said, I can't get mad at them. And so she said, you're the closest person, so I just thought I'd get mad at you. And so we both kind of laughed and the whole thing just diffused. But I found out what her disturbed. I validated that through understanding, through my meager attempt to be compassionate. And compassion is very, very healing. So again, that's a kind of opportunity we have when those situations arise to practice compassion and tolerance and patience. And sometimes we're praying to Krishna, please help me become patient and tolerant and humble and compassionate. And we're thinking that Krishna's just going to give it to us on a silver platter or turn some switch and it's going to be really easy. My experience, it doesn't happen that way. Krishna gives you opportunities to practice patience, tolerance, humility, and compassion. And literally, when we practice compassion, we might be conditioned to respond not compassionately. We might be conditioned to respond defensively or aggressively. But by practicing compassion, there's a term called neuroplasticity. We're conditioned to respond negatively. But by practicing compassionate behaviors, we can actually develop new neural pathways so our mind will more spontaneously and more easily gravitate towards compassion. But sometimes it takes practice. And that's an important thing to understand. We can practice the mode of goodness. So there's an interesting man that came to the temple in Vancouver once. He became a devotee. And he became interested in spiritual life. He bought a machine called a electroencephalograph, which measures brain waves. And he went around to different religious organizations, priests, monks, Buddhists, and he was measuring their brain waves. And he found they were all pretty far off the chart. And he met a devotee. He said, why don't you try that chanting Hare Krishna? And he tried a chanting Hare Krishna, and he noticed his own brain waves kind of settle down. And he tried it on some devotees, and he noticed when they were chanting, their minds were just way different than all these other spiritualists. So sometimes I used to fantasize, what if I had a electroencephalograph? And I thought, oh God, I'd be afraid to put that on my head when I was chanting Hare Krishna. So my mind is all over the place. So I was reading this pastime of Daksha recently. I thought, what if Daksha was wearing an electroencephalograph during that pastime of the Daksha Yajna? Daksha got completely bent, out of shape, when Lord Shiva came into the assembly and did not bow down. And Daksha's mind waves would have been like this. He became so angry, so offensive. It went on for an incredibly long time. And he was so offensive, his own daughter self-immolated. That's how offensive he was. That's how bent out of shape his mind was. His lid was so flipped. He not only flipped his lid, his lid flipped right off, and it became replaced with a goat's head, if you know that pastime. So we don't want to be Dakshas. We don't want to be Dakshas. And there's also a very nice pastime in the Bhagavatam of Jadabharta, who carried the palanquin in a very rough way, and then the king Rahugana became extremely angry and began insulting him in many ways. And it's described that Jadabharta, his mind, he felt a few little waves of dissatisfaction which he ignored. That is extremely advanced position. So we can't imitate that, but we should know that's the goal, that we want to be able to regulate our emotions in a way that we can be compassionate. And Jadabharti, he just compassionately explained the highest philosophy of life to King Rahugana, who you see taking the dust of his feet. So self-regulation is very important. And sometimes I hear people say, well, it feels good to let off steam. But what happens when you're extremely angry like that? Your mind is flooded. Your body's flooded with adrenaline and cortisol. Your lid flips, and nothing you say is going to be constructive or beneficial to you or anyone. And those are the times we make offenses. And sometimes we forget, even behind closed doors, we're with our wife, our partner, our friend, whoever. We're not in the temple. We're not going to do this in the temple, I hope. But behind closed doors, sometimes we flip our lids and we just let off the steam at someone. But it's Vaishnava Aparad. It's actually different forms of Vaishnava Aparad, and it's not beneficial. It may feel good because that adrenaline, it numbs whatever pain we have. Like some people become adrenaline junkies for sports because they get off on the adrenaline rush. That's one thing, but feeding off that adrenaline in the manifestation of anger can be extremely detrimental to our spiritual lives. So a very important part of self-regulation and compassion is something called self-compassion. There's a New Age term called mindfulness, but what mindfulness means, it just means being aware. We are pure spirit souls. We're in this body, and I have to learn how to deal with this body. Like you're in the car, again, you need to know there's a brake, an accelerator, forward and reverse, and there's a few gauges on the dashboard and a steering wheel. You know that. That's good enough. That's good enough. At least if you're aware of that. If you don't know those, you're going to have a lot of problems driving a car. So we all have emotions. We all have emotions, but what's happened, especially in the last 100, 150 years, especially in men, a culture has been created in which men are kind of conditioned and taught to think, well, I shouldn't really show emotions, I shouldn't cry, I shouldn't manifest emotions. And as a result, we tend to keep our emotions pushed down or submerged so they don't manifest, so we don't show them, so we can, be macho, be tough. But what happens is when you I won't say subdue because they're not actually subdued because they're still there. When you bury emotions, the problem is when situations arise, you tend to go to the gross emotions, such as anger. Whereas if you're a little self-compassionate, if you're a little mindful of yourself, you can be a little introspective. Okay, what am I actually feeling? Am I really angry? And actually, anger is meant for protection. If someone attacks someone that you love, you're going to exhibit anger. If you're a little frustrated by someone that you love, anger is not really an appropriate response because anger is meant for protection of someone. I might say, well, I know when you did that, it left me frustrated. Frustration is a lot different than anger. So being able to, again, name the emotion, you can deal with them in a constructive way. And when we neglect that emotional development, it can be very problematic in our lives. So again, it's very important to understand the different influences physiologically that occur within our mind that can sabotage our abilities to be compassionate. Again, there's environmental situations and also our inability to identify our emotions that we're actually feeling can also complicate things. So I'm just going to ask you for a few minutes. If you can get in groups of 4, can you all see these 4 questions? How would you like to respond when irritating conditions arise? That's number 1. Number 2, what makes it hard? And number 3, what are some things you could do to make it easier to move towards compassion? So I'm going to ask if you can just turn your chairs, maybe get in groups of 4, and just take turns going through these questions briefly, and just each one of you answer number 1, then number 2, and then number 3.
We'll hand it back over to Partha. Okay, Prabhu, we have your attention.
Okay, so if one person from each group can just give us some little summary. What are you going to take away from that group discussion and from the seminar? Is there anything you're going to take away from that? I can hear you pretty loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay. So we would like to respond to an irritating condition by giving it a little bit of time. And what makes it hard is the culture of fast-paced passion and often social media. So we would like to make it easier. We might want to take a walk. And we also might want to make sure that we resolve the situation in person.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Interesting. You're talking about taking that time out. When we're flooded, literally with that cortisol, it takes up to 20 minutes for that to be filtered out of our bloodstream. And also, you mentioned about solving the things in person. There were some statistics about solving conflicts by messaging. The chance of solving some kind of conflict by messaging, text messaging, Messenger, WhatsApp, 0% success. You want to do it in person. So go ahead.
So I think men in general have expectations. When we're working hard all day, we're on our way home. We're expecting our wives to have a nice meal ready for us. We're expecting the house clean, the kids all calm. And when we get home, that's not what happens, okay? We don't care why. We just fly off the handle and say, why isn't this done? Instead of asking, or trying to find out what happened today that you couldn't have this ready. So it's just one example. That was, what we talked about. And maybe we should lower our expectations slightly so that when we walk in, we don't fly off the handle and start screaming, why isn't this done? And find out why it wasn't done so that we can maybe calmly discuss it. That's what we pretty much thought.
Yeah, so you want to be a part of the solution.
Just a quick sideline. Chaitanya Charan, who's visiting a lot of temples on the East Coast, he recently gave a lecture and he said, yes, we've all heard the expression, love is blind. He said, and marriage is the great eye-opener.
Marriage affords you immense opportunities to develop the devotional qualities of compassion, patience, tolerance, and humility, which you require to be able to constantly chant the holy name of the Lord.
So in our group also we discuss similar patterns, right? Like one of the things is most of the time we misunderstand the situation. So in addition to buying time, ask open-ended questions back, right? Like as a validation question, right? So then also take a deep breath and also buy more time before you actually respond, right? So the other for number point 2, he said, what makes it hard is sometimes ego. Ego is there, and then sometimes they press the weak button, and there is also a pattern or a prior experience with taken for granted, right? Unfair treatment. So you're putting all those into this situation and thinking that this is also the same situation. You're responding to that in a non-compassionate fashion, right? So trying to asking the question and make sure your understanding of the situation is right, and then responding.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
So what became clear from our discussion is that what makes it difficult is that these emotions are so intense and they're so sudden. Naveen Shankagu was describing it's like a volcano erupting. And I realized that what makes it hard also is actually we take great pleasure, or at least I take pleasure in pointing out when someone does wrong. And so what's difficult is that I'm contaminated. I enjoy lording it over. And so how to change this, how to do better, would be to associate with those who are pure, and then learning a new way of responding, and seeing what compassion really looks like, and being treated.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then once you receive that compassion, then you feel so full and you want to then give it. So thank you, Prabhu.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. Anyone else? Mangalananda can voluntold someone who hasn't spoken yet.
Someone is on their way.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji, wonderful, wonderful session. One of the points we discussed is staying grounded and staying in mode of goodness, and literally what will happen, what will help to staying in mode of goodness is like staying connected with Krishna in the, like by chanting or reading the Bhagavatam or any devotional process can keep you more in mode of goodness and grounded. That can help to stay calm and quiet and deal the situation naturally.
Mm-hmm.
That's the point. Thank you, Prabhu.
I'll take one more representative from one group, then we'll do a quick wrap up here.
Any group that hasn't gone yet? Yes, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. So now discussion, what would you like, how would you like to respond when in this irritating conditions arise? Somebody said about, we also came to the decision to pause. Pausing makes us think a little more. What makes it hard, it sometimes depends on what the person has said, the other person. It might even connect to some other situation that we've had in the past, and then make us just overreact, so it makes the situation a lot worse. What are some of the things we could do to make it easier to move towards compassion? We talked about pausing, but then we also came up with the decision that when we're pausing, we should chant the Hare Krishna mantra within that time that we're pausing, because the mantra is that powerful. And then the final thing is the fact that, and this is credit to you, Partha Prabhu, the fact that we've discussed this at all will make us think twice when situations like that come up in the future. Hare Krishna.
Thank you. There's one verse, I think it's in the 11th canto, in which is described that it's very difficult or almost impossible, even for saintly persons, when they experience harsh words from someone, those words come like a sharp arrow that touches one's heart. So that's actually what it's like in those situations. But yoga is meant to practice this kind of self-control and compassion. And again, we're so fortunate to have the grace of Srila Prabhupada's association. Because by his mercy, we can move from anger to kindness. And again, we have that ability. We have that Sva Tantra Ratna. We have that gem that's Krishna given us of self-choice. That in those situations, if we embrace that gem, we can make that decision. And so here's a couple, we'll just end with some words from Srila Prabhupada. I think that are some keys of wisdom. Srila Prabhupada's given us these jewels of wisdom and knowledge. And again, very important, we try to embrace these. So I'll just read this because it sounds not so great. If I have you read it. From Bhagavad Gita 14:10, purport. But if one wants, he can develop by practice the mode of goodness, and thus defeat the modes of ignorance and passion. So again, here Prabhupada's pointing out, it's by practice. We may not get it right the first time, the second time. And in these situations when they arise, something happens between you and your friend, partner, spouse, wife, whoever. If you don't get it right, you can always say, well, you know what? I didn't get that right, or we didn't get that right. Let's rewind that and try that again. You have that opportunity. You can try it again. So that's important. By practice. And to sum up, as Srila Prabhupada says in Bhagavad Gita 6.5, a man must elevate himself by his own mind and not degrade himself. The mind is the friend of the conditioned soul and his enemy as well. And from Bhagavad Gita 6.43, one should control the lower self by the higher self. So again, Prabhupada, he's given us this highest knowledge, and there's tools we can utilize to help us apply that knowledge. And specifically, as we discussed today, these understandings of psychology and physiology, how they impact how we react to different things, understanding that can actually help us apply the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita. And it's extremely important for us to see it's not only for our own benefit and our family's benefit, it's also for the benefit of the whole movement in the whole world. Because the more we can fully integrate compassion into our lives, the more effective we're going to be as representatives of Srila Prabhupada and Lord Chaitanya's mission. When we actually live compassion, when we preach, our words will also be weighted with that compassion. Even if we don't have compassion, even we're falling short in so many ways, I'm falling short in many ways, but if I'm trying to repeat the words of my spiritual master, it has potency. If we can learn to actually fully embrace and live and practice Krishna consciousness, our words will become very, very impactful. So it's a great responsibility, and if we see that as a responsibility to Krishna and Srila Prabhupada, Krishna can actually help us to develop these qualities of humility and tolerance and patience. So again, I ask you all to remember that Krishna has given us this gift, Sva Tantra Ratna. He's given us this precious gem of the ability to make the choice when situations arise. And we should embrace that, hold that very close to our hearts. And in those trying circumstances, remember that we have that gem we can hold in those circumstances to help empower us to make the right decisions. And we have the guidance instructions of Srila Prabhupada. So I'd like to thank you all very much for your participation in the seminar. I hope you got something from it. I'm going to ask you all a favor. When you finish, if you can go to Radha Vrindavan Chandra and say a prayer to them, that my dear Radha Vrindavan Chandra, please help get Partha Dasa out of the passport purgatory. Get it to you if you can do that. So I don't do. If we have any time, we can take questions. If not, we can end here.
We're kind of out of time, but maybe we can take one question, okay, Partha Prabhu?
Sure, one question. Sounds good.
You may have a pressing question. Andres asked a question every session since we started, so we're going to say no to Andres.
You can do it both at the same time, maybe. So I record loudly so everyone can hear.
Thank you, Prabhu, for the wonderful session. We're really indebted to you for this amazing session. I just wanted to ask you the 3 questions that you had, told every one of us to, do the exercise about. We have had similar sessions in the past where, maybe a lot of new things might have not come, but every time we hear it, but when it's a time of practical application, it becomes so difficult to apply. So if you have to answer those 3 questions that we did in the exercise, what would be that, and what would be the top secret of responding to such difficult situations?
One thing that greatly helped me was this hand model of the brain. I understood the brain parts, the prefrontal cortex, the amygdala, limbic system. I intellectually understood how the relation, but it was kind of vague to me. But the psychologist named Dan Siegel And Raj, I think, has sent you all a summary of the session we did, and there's a link to a little video. It's only a 3-minute video in which he explains this hand model, and it's very helpful because you can actually visualize. We heard the expression "flip the lid," but this is why we flip the lid, and just understanding that can make a huge difference in being able to actually apply the philosophy and apply that understanding in those circumstances. So sometimes things which are very complicated, if you can break it down into something very simple, it becomes much more easy to apply. And I think also one thing that's helpful is realizing that conflict isn't bad. Conflict is normal. In life, even in the spiritual world, you see between Radha and Krishna, there's always these disconnects, there's conflicts. But when Radha and Krishna come back together, it's sweeter. And so in relationships, there's a force that drives you apart, and there's a force that's pulling you together. But there's a very important force, very essential, is the force that you exhibit, whether it's in your marriage, friendship, or relationships, the force you exhibit to bring the disconnects back into connection and to prevent the disconnections. And that's what makes relationships grow and become strong, when you work through those things. So again, it's not to be afraid of conflict, don't run away from conflict, but find the means to deal with conflict in constructive and healthy ways. So I'm just getting this message on my computer, even though it's plugged in that the battery's low, so maybe that's a signal for me to...
Arthur, one more question. Just
okay.
a doubt that I sense, because I'm getting more in touch with my feminine nature, so I'm picking up things on a subtle level. What do you say?
Can I correct? I think it's your spiritual nature, which is Prakriti, which in a sense is feminine. Because when we say feminine nature, some of the guys are going to go, I don't want to have feminine nature. But you have spiritual nature, which is Prakriti, which is feminine. So.
My feminine nature, so it's okay. So here's the question. Just everything is great, and in most situations it works, and it's wonderful, and we've all walked away with some things that are going to work. But Partha Prabhu, what about when the other person is really, 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 really repeatedly difficult to deal with? Any special tips on that?
That's
a bedrooms thinks we're thinking about you. Just take it that way and learn how to do better.
So you're asking a question when you have to deal with an individual who is repeatedly extremely challenging and difficult to deal with.
Yeah, is there any special tips or anything that you've discussed that you would prioritize?
It's hard to say without, every situation is different. There are individuals who, due to some reason, some trauma, deeply ingrained, they can become very narcissistic, very self-centered, and very challenging to deal with. And sometimes in those situations, it depends what we're talking about. If we're talking about marriage or friendship or sometimes, like a situation in marriage, or that kind of situation, it can actually become emotionally abusive. And in those kind of circumstances, it might require the partner who's on the receiving end of that to say, I'm not willing to accept this behavior. If you're willing to make some effort to get some help to deal with your anger or whatever problems it is that you'll have to define, then I'm willing to stay in this relationship. Otherwise, I'm out the door. Sometimes that can help individuals who are abusive to rectify themselves. They actually get counseling. Someone may have some minor trauma that you might be able to talk through and work it out. That's possible. But if you find it's a repeated thing and progress isn't being made in that relationship, either you will have to somehow encourage or try to twist the person's arm for them to get some help, some counseling to deal with the internal issues that are sabotaging their own relationships with other people. Or if that's unsuccessful, you may have to step back from that relationship if it's too damaging.
just convinced all the team members to not work with me.
That's a whole other topic.
Okay, let's have a fantastic round of applause.
So, thank you very much. I wish I was here. I wish I was here with you. So I would just like to give you all a big group hug right now.
Oh.